In 1933, a Nazi went to Palestine, and he wasn't alone. He went with his wife, and he was accompanied by two others, a Jewish couple. And it's important that you know about it because the story of why they went, their mission, is more complicated and nuanced than people think. And because the commemorative coin that was struck by the magazine that sent them is all over the internet, always surrounded by a load of dangerous misinformation. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Tsoha. I'm an independent scholar, and I talk a lot online about niche, fun topics like diasporism, the history of Judaism, Jewish anti-Zionism, and so much more, with my specialty being the discussion of Jewish folk religion. As much as I wish I could do this off the top, I do in fact have a multi-thousand word script, so I'll be looking slightly off camera so I can talk about it. I love citations, and so they're always included. You can find them in the description of this video, and I really do encourage you to read them. With that being said, let's dive in. Every time I try and say his name, Zungenbrecher. So, the Nazi in question, Leopold von Mildenstein, was born in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He was born in Prague, and he was a member of the noble class. What exactly his noble status was has been sort of debated. He's referred to as a baron, including by his own daughter, but other sources say that he was an Edler, which is a status of nobility we don't really have in English, but it basically is the lowest rank of nobility. So he had Austrian, Hungarian, Czech, and German citizenships, and he was a baptized member of the Roman Catholic Church. He became a member of the Nazi Party in 1929 before they took power. And so when he joined the Nazi Party, he did various things. And then in 1933, he worked for the Nazi government. In 1935, he was appointed to the Sicherheitsdienst des Reichsführers SS, or the SD, which was a Nazi intelligence party within the SS. And eventually, he was appointed to the SS Office for Jewish Affairs, or the Judenreferat. Sources claim that he was the one who recruited Otto Adolf Eichmann, who is said to be one of the architects of the Holocaust. And during Eichmann's interrogation, he named von Mildenstein as his master and said that Mildenstein knew more about Judaism than all of his superiors combined. And you might be wondering, how? Well, you'll find out. And during Eichmann's live trial in 1961, it was said that it was von Mildenstein who was the initiator of the removal of Jews from public life. Why? Because it was the answer to the Jewish question. You may have heard the term the final solution, and you may know that it has something to do with the Holocaust. But in order to understand it, you have to understand the question to which this was the solution, and that was the Jewish question. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, politicians, intellectuals, philosophers, activists frequently engaged with the Jewish question, including Jews. I mean, we have Herzl, Max Nordau, Leon Trotsky, Moses Mendelssohn, Karl Marx, Hannah Arendt. Those are just a few of the famous Jews who publicly engaged and talked about the Jewish question during their lifetime. These were discussions and debates and philosophies about the status of Jews in European society as they were being granted rights for the very first time. Because you may not know this, but for centuries, Jews absolutely did not have the basic civil rights or legal status as Christians did in Europe. We were at various points and in various locales banned from owning land, from being part of guilds, which was basically the only way you could effectively do any sort of trade, from participating in many kinds of work, not just because we weren't allowed to guilds, but you literally could not do it because it would get you killed or expelled or tortured or burned to death, etc., right? And we weren't even allowed to do basic things in certain places at certain times, like selling bread, which is why, by the way, bagels exist. Yeah, if you want a video on that, please, I'm more than happy to get into it. But we have all of this history of Jews not being allowed to do those things because we weren't given basic civil human rights. And part of it was that we were literally forced to identify ourselves by our clothing. We were forced to wear specific items like we had to wear specific hats, or we had to wear specific colors, or we had to wear badges to identify ourselves. An example of the color thing is that in Poland, for a long time, Jewish women were forced to cover their hair with a yellow headscarf. Not just, they had to be yellow specifically to indicate that they were Jewish. And Jewish dress was so specific and well known that in Hungary, for example, as the punishment for being convicted of the crime of witchcraft as a first offense, your punishment was to stand all day in the village square dressed as a Jew. That was so bad to be seen as a Jew. It was literally the punishment for the crime of witchcraft. And in legal cases, we were oftentimes forced to engage in our own humiliation. For example, there was a tradition of forcing Jews, if you were going to testify in court, to force Jews to stand on the bloody sow hide as they're testifying. A bloody sow hide, by the way, that is a female pig's hide. And that's because Jews don't eat pork, so it was considered humiliating and disgusting for us to do that. So, as legal status was being granted to Jews across the European continent, the Jewish question was being debated because what were they going to do with all the Jews? And so these debates were being held in many areas, all about the status, integration, and identity of the Jewish people as we were being granted civil rights for the first time, which, by the way, did not happen all at once. Here's a quick list. It was in France in 1791, the Netherlands 1796, Greece 1830, Belgium 1831, Denmark 1849, United Kingdom 1858, Italy from between 1861 to 1870, Austria 1867, Hungary 1867, Germany 1871, Switzerland 1874, Bulgaria 1878, Serbia 1878, Russia 1917, and Romania, 1919. And the name The Final Solution comes from the fact that the mass extermination of Jews, the mass murder of all Jews, was the final solution to the question. It was the final answer, because it wasn't their first answer. Nazis toyed with multiple means of removing Jews from society, and this wasn't new. They were drawing on a very long tradition of banning Jews and other undesirables, right? There is a lizard on my window. Sorry, one sec. Okay, back to this. The Nazis were drawing on a very long history, right? This is the same continent that brought you the Inquisition, which forced you to convert to Catholicism under literal threat of death. And if you didn't convert to Catholicism, you had to get out. No, you can't take anything with you. Just get out, and we might murder you anyway. And if you become Catholic, we might murder you anyway, because we don't trust you filthy Jews to actually be good Catholics. How dare you, right? So this also, same continent, by the way, brought you the Crusades. This is not new. I think a lot of people really attach themselves to the myth that the Nazis were importing racism from elsewhere, which is true in some sense. Yes, they were absolutely inspired by the atrocities being committed in the Americas, right? By the horrors of chattel slavery, of Jim Crow, of the blood purity race one-drop rule. Why am I out of focus? Yes, the Nazis did import racism from elsewhere, but they also had plenty in their own backyard. In 1933, a Nazi went to Palestine. In 1933, a Nazi went to Palestine. And I want to talk about it for a couple of reasons. And during the period of von Mildenstein's tenure as the head of his department, he believed that Jews were not suitable for good Aryan society, and we must be removed for the health and safety of all good Aryans. And he was not alone in this notion, obviously, right? Even though it was a little bit after his time, there was an entire plan known as the Madagascar Plan, which is exactly what it sounds like. The plan to relocate all Polish Jews to Madagascar. Von Mildenstein had a different idea. He wanted to send all the Jews to another place, Palestine. According to Professor Shaw Ladani, who's a two-time Olympian and a Holocaust survivor, quote, Mildenstein's series of articles described the Jewish yishuv in bright colors. He wrote about the establishment of Jewish life there, about the institutions being built, etc. The Nazis wanted to encourage the Jews to leave Germany. In the beginning, they didn't necessarily want to get rid of Jews through extermination, as they did later on. In discourse online, people like to claim that Nazis were in full and total support of Zionism, and this just isn't true. While there were Nazis like von Mildenstein who were in support of the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine for a period, this was not the majority or the overwhelming consensus or even a consensus between Nazis in general. And the period in which they supported it predates their ultimate conclusion, which was that Jews must be entirely eradicated. Intellectual honesty in the face of convenient misinformation is a necessity and a moral imperative. As the historian in the documentary The Flat, which we'll talk about later, says, there was a temporary mutual interest in getting Jews out of Europe and into Palestine on the part of the Nazis and Zionists. But that wouldn't last very long, nor was it very strong. Von Mildenstein himself would go on to become an anti-Zionist as a means of propagating Jew hate. And we'll talk about it later during the discussion about the Haavara Agreement, because it was not popular even within Zionist circles in Germany, and even less so in Zionist circles outside of Germany. And we know why this misinformation is so popular online, right? The conspiracy of blaming Jews for the Holocaust is extremely popular in many areas, in many spheres, even in so-called progressive ones, right? You'll see claims of this from all corners of the world, and they'll say that it was actually the Jews who paid for the Holocaust, or it was the Zionists who orchestrated it. And in many cases, yeah, they are actually using the term the term Zionist as a synonym for the word Jew, even though Jew does not equal Zionist and Zionist does not equal Jew, right? There are more Christian Zionists in the United States alone than there are Jews of any political affiliation in the entire world. And this is because for some people, the truth is not enough. History is not enough. They require something more bombastic and outlandish every single time, instead of focusing on intellectual honesty and moral clarity, as I believe we should. As the Nazi government was ramping up their anti-Jewish, pro-Aryan governmental reach, the Jewish communities of Europe were terrified. This wasn't the first time anti-Semites had come into power, far from it. But there was something different about the Nazi government than previous anti-Jewish ones. On April 1st of 1933, the Nazi government organized a nationwide boycott of Jewish businesses. 1 week later, the law for the restoration of the professional civil service removed Jews from many, if not most, public government positions and marked the beginning of a broader campaign of exclusion of Jews from daily life in Germany. On the 25th of the same month, the Nazi government implemented quotas on the number of Jews allowed in schools and university, and Jews both inside and Germany and abroad were not blind to how quickly the Nazi government was making changes. And Jews were ready to fight back. The Jewish Labor Bund, for example, organized a widespread, incredibly well-organized boycott of German goods, and a boycott committee was established in the US as well. And we'll discuss that later when we talk about the Haavara Agreement, because they were also putting out calls for a united anti-fascist labor front, and they joined the Aid Committee for the Victim of Fascism in Germany, and around the globe, there was a rally. Okay, in America, in New York City, there was a rally of 50,000 people who were raising the alarm about the actions of the Nazi government. And so as Jews were facing this increasing bigotry on an interpersonal level and on a governmental level in 1933, the Zionist Federation of Germany was looking for a solution. And according to the Center for Jewish Art, quote, the Zionist movement was inclined to cooperate with the line that the Nazi government adopted at the time, encouraging migration of German Jews to Palestine. And then on the 4th of April, 1933, just after the beginning of the boycott of the Jewish businesses, the Zionist biweekly publication, the Jüdische Rundschau, or the Jewish Review, published an article which stated, "Wear it with pride, the yellow badge." Quote, in 1933, the yellow badge, of course, was still meant symbolically. Even the most skeptical Zionists did not foresee that it would actually be reintroduced 8 years later. And the word reintroduced is key, right? As we talked about earlier, this was not the first time Jews were forced to identify ourselves by our clothing. The Zionist Federation of Germany was going against what a lot of Jews wanted. They were formed in 1897 in Köln, and they had over 10,000 members by 1914. They wanted to elect one member to speak to von Mildenstein on behalf of the organization, because they published in the Jüdische Rundschau on the 7th of April that, quote, they believed that only the Zionist Federation could approach the Nazis in good faith as honest partners. In come Kurt Tüchler. He was a German Jew who served as a lawyer and a judge in Berlin. He was an active Zionist. He was a decorated World War I veteran, and he was also a managing member of the Zionist Federation of Germany. Kurt approached von Mildenstein, and the two made plans. They planned to travel with their wives to Palestine for at least a month, maybe 2 months. We don't actually know how long they spent there because some of the dates seem to be strange, but we know it was at least a month. And Kurt didn't just ask von Mildenstein to come with him to Palestine. He wanted him to write about it. And the magazine, Der Angriff, one of the primary propaganda outlets of Nazi Germany. Der Angriff, which means the attack, was founded in 1927 by Joseph Goebbels, and its name was meant to reflect its style, right? Constantly attacking political opponents, really not shying away from its fascist core. It was proudly and loudly fascist, and pro-Nazi, because that's what it was meant to do. It was constantly disseminating racist, anti-Jewish, anti-Romani propaganda. And it also had things like romance stories in it, because who doesn't love Nazi romance? Goebbels would become Hitler's Minister of Propaganda by 1933, and Der Angriff was rapidly expanding throughout Germany and abroad. And I don't think most people realize how totalitarian the Nazi propaganda machine was. And I've covered this before in my article on Christmas trees and why Christmas trees aren't pagan, which may seem odd until you realize that the modern idea of the pagan Christmas tree was disseminated through Nazi propaganda. It was part of the propaganda machine. And we're not just talking, one newspaper here or there. We're talking many dozens of newspapers, radio, TV, movies, pamphlets, zines, flyers, leaflets, advertisements, songs, Christmas carols, food packaging, Christmas decor. You ever seen a swastika garland meant for a Christmas tree? I have, and now you have too. You couldn't throw a stone in Nazi Germany without hitting a piece of propaganda. That's how totalitarian it was. It was unbelievable, their reach. And so, they went. Von Mildenstein documented his experiences under the pen name LIN in a series entitled Ein Nazi fährt nach Palästina, which is still available online to read. I printed it out so I could do research and actually highlight things. You can find it in the citations below if you want to read the original German. From the Center of Jewish History, quote, "The writer Leopold von Mildenstein describes his voyage to Palestine as a National Socialist, reporting on the Zionist development and activity in Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, and various settlements, and examining the possibility of mass Jewish migration to the country. He wrote exceedingly positively about his experience. The article begins, mind you, it was a 12-article series. The first one here begins, Shalom, shalom, that is the watchword. It is the greeting among Zionists. It is sort of like when we say, Haye. And of course, he writes about his trip through an incredibly Orientalist lens. He fetishizes, exoticizes, and romanticizes the people he comes in contact with, not as fellow humans, but as sort of species that he's looking in on. And he, of course, writes about how Jews have come to terms with their Oriental nature, and how Germany is not sending enough Jews to Palestine because Zionism is of the Ostjuden, or the Eastern Jews, in which case he doesn't mean Middle East, he means Eastern Europe. This was the second article in this series, and there's a heading entitled A Jewish Fascist, which is about a Jew he meets on the boat to Palestine. I'll read part of it. I'll read the translation for you now. The boy across from me, a Palestinian, wears a red badge on his sash, a small 7-branched candelabrum. We strike up a conversation. He is a Trumpeldor man. That's the name given to the followers of the Russian Jewish Captain Trumpeldor, who fought against the Arabs here in Palestine shortly after the war. His followers, who had been one of the leaders of the Jewish Legion, now represent the fascist faction within the Jewish community. They are rabid nationalists, averse to any compromise on the matters of the Jewish national cause. Their political party is the Revisionist. Their leader, Jabotinsky, is the enfant terrible of every Zionist Congress. He cannot forgive the British for having, contrary to their promises, disarmed the Jewish Legion in Palestine at the end of the war, instead of entrusting it with the military defense of the country. Thus, he is at odds with the British just as much with the Arabs. His troops are uniformed. Their trousers and shirts are chocolate brown. They also wear belts and shoulder straps. Stars on the cuffs serve as rank insignia. From these ranks spring the Jewish militia in the country, and the Jews have often needed it, for the interests of the British are not always the interests of the Jews. And here we sort of see an interesting sticking point. People really do get hung up on. They get hung up on the fact that Kurt was Jewish and Leopold was a Nazi, but they were friends. Yeah, Kurt wasn't just any Jew. He was a convenient Jew. He was highly educated. He was irreligious, and he was a good companion until the time to get rid of him, right? Having a singular Jewish friend did not stop von Mildenstein from believing that we were inferior to him. Just as him seeing Palestinian Arabs and being like, wow, look at that, didn't stop him from believing them to be inferior to him, right? He didn't stop believing in Nazi propaganda simply because of one Jew. In fact, he continued to believe it, and he continued to promote the idea that Nazis should be exterminated when that was the solution that his government came to. The government, mind you, that he joined willingly and enthusiastically. The National Library of Israel Archives has pages from a Jewish man's journal, Moshe Yaakov ben Gavriel, who wrote, quote, "I heard from the Nazi, a young and not unpleasant man, that he arrived from Berlin a few weeks ago, accompanied by the jurist Tichler, strange people, and that they are traveling from settlement to settlement in order to write articles for this official newspaper. The guest was very excited about the building going on in the land, even attempting to say a few words in Hebrew and generally trying to act in a cultured manner. I remained very cautious and tried to get more information out of him. For this purpose, even scheduled another meeting with him. We talked about all types of subjects, but regarding the developments in Germany, not a word." Kurt wrote that von Mildenstein returned an enthusiastic Zionist, but that wouldn't last very long. So let's get into why we're here. The coin. To commemorate the publication starting the next year on September 9th of 1934, Der Angriff struck coins with a swastika on one side and a Star of David on the other. We don't actually know how many coins were made or how many are still in existence. There are many in collections, museum collections, and they keep coming up for sale on Nazi paraphernalia auction houses. They're not super common. I think the cheapest one I saw for sale was $450. And even in the 80s, the Jerusalem Post talked about this. This isn't a new topic, but the proliferation of the sort of misinformation surrounding them has made them a lot more popular. The Center for Jewish History has the article series from the Jerusalem Post in it, where it doesn't just talk about this one challenge coin, but the history of challenged coins, which were often incredibly anti-Jewish. Despite representing a very specific time and place and circumstance, this coin is often used online to forge a narrative of greater collaboration between the Nazis and the Zionists than actually existed. And that brings us back to the discussion of boycotts and how they ultimately ended in what is known as the Haavara Agreement. For this section, I'm going to be quoting from Yad Vashem's Shoah Resource Center in the article entitled "The Transfer Agreement and the Boycott Movement, a Jewish Dilemma on the Eve of the Holocaust." In the summer of 1933, the Jewish Agency for Palestine, the German Zionist Federation, and the German Economics Ministry drafted a plan meant to allow German Jews emigrating to Palestine to retain some of the value of their property in Germany by purchasing German goods for the Yishuv, which would redeem them in Palestine local currency. This scheme, known as the Transfer Agreement, or Haavara, met the needs of all interested parties: German Jews, the German economy, and the mandatory government and the Yishuv in Palestine. Many Jews were critical of the agreement from the very outset. The negotiations between the Zionist movement and official representatives of Nazi Germany evoked much wrath. The negotiations and agreement they spawned were profoundly controversial in broad Jewish circles. For this reason, until 1935, the Jewish Agency masked its role in the agreement and attempted to pass it off as an economic agreement between private parties. Again, it was not. It was with the Nazi government was involved. The boycott of German goods by the Jewish world was historically marginal, but at the time, the Nazis viewed it as lethal. Quote, "Correspondence between Heinrich Wolf, the German consul in Palestine, and the German Foreign Ministry shows that shattering the boycott was a key motive for the German authorities in concluding the transfer agreement." There were internal struggles between the Jews in Germany and the Jews outside of Germany, with large populations absolutely supporting the boycott, and others worried that the boycott would cause more harm to the Jews in Germany. And it is vital to note that the Zionist Jewish community of Germany was not synonymous with German Jewry as a whole. There was an entire faction of Jews who did not believe that the forced emigration to Palestine was the solution for the evil that was rotting in German society. Zionism would not go on to be the de facto political position of Jews until after the Holocaust. Hi, don't mind me interrupting real quick. You might have noticed that this video is not sponsored. That's because this YouTube channel is not able to be monetized yet. So there is no sponsor and there are hopefully no ads, which means that the only way you can support me is via things like my coffee or my Venmo. I also have a store. You can buy so many cool books. You can buy candles, lots of fun things. That's jewwitches.com. And I have a Patreon where you can get 6 years worth of content, including, if you join our $10 plus tier, my Discord. Okay, back to the video. In the early 1930s, a huge portion of Jews were anti-Zionist in the sense that they did not believe in nationalism as the answer for anyone. In the US, the American Reform community was still operating under the 1885 Pittsburgh Platform, which explicitly stated, quote, "We consider ourselves no longer a nation but a religious community and therefore expect no return to Palestine." And they wouldn't adopt a softened stance towards Zionism until 1937. And by the way, if you're interested, Rabbi Andy Kahn over at the American Council for Judaism, which is a legacy anti-Zionist Jewish org that was founded in the 1940s, he did a really good article about the coup of Zionism into American Reform Judaism. It's a really good article. I'll link it below. And I recently did an interview with him for ACJ that was just a lot of fun. We talked about a lot of different topics about Jewish community, Jewish anti-Zionism, that sort of thing. So I'll link them both in the description if you're interested and want to learn a little bit more about Jewish anti-Zionist history in the US. And so even as there were Jews in Germany and abroad who believed that a retaliatory boycott of German goods by Jews would ultimately hurt Jews in the end, there were Jews in Germany and again abroad who were all for and were actively organizing their own boycott. But again, the Haavara Agreement, right? The Nazi government did not believe that their already unstable government and economy could handle a boycott of German goods by Jews. And remember, even though we now know that the GDP impact would have been negligible, it was seen by Nazis as lethal. Because again, it wasn't just Jews in Germany, it was Jews around the world. And let's think about it. Germany's neighbor, Poland, was roughly 10% Jewish before the Holocaust. And as I was doing reading, I came across this quote from the New York Times article in 1933 that I thought was particularly powerful. W.W. Cohen says any Jew who buys goods made in Germany is a traitor. A strict boycott against German merchandise to serve as protest against Nazi anti-Semitism was urged last night by former Representative William W. Cohen at a meeting of the Executive Advisory Committee of the Jewish War Veterans of the United States at Hotel Knickerbocker. Hilarious hotel name, really powerful stuff. And that event at the Hotel Knickerbocker was only made possible because the US and Britain had significant Jewish populations ready to halt all business with Germany. And vital to remember in case of British Jews, Britain's colony, Palestine, imported more from Britain than anywhere else, and their second place, the second most imported place from, Germany. But despite all of this international support and documentation, the boycott was doomed to fail. During his trip, von Mildenstein documents seeing Nazi flags on German boats in the harbors, and they would remain flowing in because of the Haavara Agreement, which irrevocably weakened the boycott. And it did so, saving the lives of some 60,000 Jews. And that also can't be forgotten. In 2011, a documentary was produced by Arnon Goldfinger, who is the grandchild of the Tuchlers who fled Berlin for Tel Aviv on November 23rd of 1936. Gerda and Kurt relocated to Tel Aviv, and as Arnon said, quite memorably, it was like their apartment was a portal to Berlin. His mother, Chana, was born in Berlin, but lived most of her life in Tel Aviv and would never dream of moving back. But her parents, they never wanted to flee. I'm going to put on the screen right now a powerful moment from the documentary talking about many German Jews, but to the US, to Canada, also to Argentina, to South America, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa. This was very common. Goldfinger tracked down two journalists who wrote about the entire affair of the trip to Palestine with the Nazi, and they interviewed Gerda. And she shared that the von Mildensteins had escorted them to the train station as they left for Tel Aviv, where they gave them their new Palestinian address, and they would write letters back and forth until 1939. And then after the Holocaust, Gerda shares that the von Mildensteins wrote letters, and they tried to clear his name as a Nazi. And she refers to them as Persil letters. Persil is a very popular German detergent we now have in the US. Persil, as they call it. It's kind of like saying he tried to Clorox his name, right? He was trying to clean up his name. She says that she and Kurt never wrote back. But through his research, we find that despite what she told the reporters, they remained friends with the von Mildensteins after the Holocaust. Edda, von Mildenstein's daughter, met with Arnon in her home in Wuppertal and discussed her memories of them, showing letters from Gerda from 1956. But the heartbreaking revelations don't really end there. He learns that his great-grandmother, Susanna Lehmann, the mother of Gerda, didn't just die of old age, as he had assumed. She had been murdered by the Nazi government. She had been deported from Berlin to Riga before she was eventually murdered during the Holocaust. Chana, Gera's daughter, didn't know this. She didn't know about the fate of her grandmother. And she had sort of a attitude towards it that I think is very familiar for some of us, right? I didn't ask and she didn't tell me. I didn't want to know. And there's a moment in the documentary where he's interviewing another German Jew who fled. And she's like, yeah, our children, they don't want to know. You are the first generation that actually wants to learn and wants to know because it's not as painful for you. So you might be wondering about Leopold von Mildenstein. What happened to him? What happened to this Nazi? Well, we're going to start with the myth of denazification in Germany. It's one that people love to promote. They love to say, Germany learned from its mistakes. It learned from its crimes. No, Germany never fully denazified because denazification was not Germany's goal. Nazis were readily accepted into societies and governmental positions around the globe, including in the United States. And they were readily accepted, provided they just sweep it under the rug a little. And that's what von Mildenstein did. His daughter believed that he was a journalist during the war. But journalist is not accurate. After he stepped down willingly from his position at the head of the Jewish Affairs Office, where, mind you, he was eventually replaced with Eichmann, Adolf Eichmann, he stepped down, and during his time, by the way, there, he readily went and participated and attended Zionist conferences and promoted the notion of Jews immigrating from Germany to Palestine, promoted the idea of getting rid of Jews from Germany. And then as soon as the Nazis switched up their line and said, actually, getting rid of them is not enough, we need to kill them all, he didn't just stop. He wrote in fervent support of it at his new position in Goebbels' propaganda ministry. He was a journalist as much as a butcher is someone who works with animals. Sure, it may technically be true, but that is not the whole truth. He would go on to publish 2 books about the Middle East before eventually being recruited to work for Coca-Cola. Yeah, and he wouldn't end his government work there. In the 1950s, he traveled to the U.S. to obtain an exchange grant on behalf of journalists because he was then, in May 1956, he had been elected to the Liberal Free Democratic Party's press committee. Yeah. And CIA documents report that he worked then also for the Egyptian government for its work in the Voice of the Arabs radio station. And then after Eichmann's arrest, he claimed he had an operational relationship with the CIA and therefore claimed immunity. Now, the CIA never confirmed, but considering that he was literally name-dropped by Eichmann during his trials, and yet he was never prosecuted for anything, mind you, he wasn't just name-dropped. He was specifically mentioned as the initiator of the removal of Jews from public life in Germany. So, yeah. All of this is to say, now you know the history of that coin, what it means and what it doesn't mean. And I want to remind you all, stick to the truth. Let integrity, moral clarity, and honesty be your guide. As always, there are places to give tzedakah or donations in the description, including to the World Central Kitchen, which is doing absolutely life-saving work in Gaza. Thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you again soon. Bye.